A man named Jim Powell is talking on the phone with his friend about his father, saying they didn't know he had heart problems. His father had a large collection of arrowheads and paid attention to nothing else after their mom died. Jim then enters a grocery shop where he meets an old buddy. His buddy expresses condolences for his father's death. Jim asks if his father had any symptoms of a heart attack. His buddy says no. He seemed completely fine and was very excited to receive a new order related to some adventure. Jim receives the order meant for his late father and leaves. Jim enters his home and opens the parcel. Inside, he finds items related to hunting and camping. He then opens a box of snacks and discovers some old maps. As he starts reading them, someone knocks at the door. It's his sister, who expresses her grief over their father's death and introduces her friend Janie to him. Later, Jim is coming out of a shop when he meets Mr. Grady. Jim sits next to Mr. Grady and asks what is bothering his dad. Initially rude, Mr. Grady eventually reveals that Jared was causing trouble for Jim's dad. Jim shares his findings from the map, mentioning papers with hand-drawn arrowheads and letters like O.R. and O. Mr. Grady, becomes very angry and warns Jim not to speak about it so loudly. Jim leaves, and Mr. Grady is seen talking to someone on the phone. Back at home, Jim searches Google to figure out the maps, but falls asleep in the process. He is awakened by a phone call. Jim is driving through a lush, green, hilly area. He stops his car, gets out, and examines the maps in his hands but doesn't find anything. He returns to his car and calls his sister, asking for help locating the place he's trying to find. She mentions Terry Court. Jim then heads to Terry's place, but when he arrives, Terry is not there. Several men are sitting around, and when Jim asks about Terry, they claim not to know him and ask why Jim is looking for him. Jim explains that he wants to learn something related to his dad. One of the men then admits he is Terry and that he was just messing with Jim. However, Terry refuses to tell him anything, so Jim leaves. That night, Jim is awakened by footsteps. He follows the noise with a gun in his hand, only to discover it's just a cat. In the morning, Jim drinks tea while studying the drawings. He wonders why everyone is reluctant to give him clear information and keeps telling him to mind his own business. Determined to uncover the truth, Jim resolves to figure out everything on his own. The doorbell rings, and Jim opens the door to find his friend Sheriff Glenn standing there. Sheriff Glenn expresses his condolences for Jim's father's death. Jim invites him inside for some cereal, but Sheriff Glenn declines, explaining that he has somewhere to be. Sheriff Glenn then asks why Jim was at Terry's place. Jim reveals that his dad had mentioned Terry was a good friend, so he went there to ask him some questions about his dad. Later, Jim is at a restaurant bar when Janie joins him and sits next to him. They engage in a lively and friendly conversation. Jim opens up about the mysteries surrounding his dad, including the mysterious maps and drawings. He also shares his meeting with Sheriff Glenn and expresses frustration over the strange behaviors of everyone involved. Jim is practicing his shooting skills when his student arrives unexpectedly. The student warns Jim that people are starting to suspect him for asking too many questions about his dad. Jim finds it absurd that he could be arrested for simply seeking information. Later, Jim is traveling through hilly areas with all his camping gear when some troublemakers stop him and begin harassing him. Jim explains that he's doing research and asks them to leave him alone, but one of the boys named Hawk challenges him. Jim swiftly takes down Hawk and continues on his way. However, Hawk calls someone to report Jim's location and direction. Following directions from a map found at his father's place, Jim navigates through the jungle when he encounters a pack of wolves. He prepares his gun, but then spots a car with people engaged in mysterious activities nearby. That night, Jim is setting up his tent when he sees flashlights approaching. He quickly hides behind trees as the same troublemakers arrive and begin searching for him. Jim makes a run for it to save himself when suddenly a girl named Gola appears and warns him to stay quiet. Gola begins preparing medication for Jim's injuries as they converse about their respective tribes. She reveals that she knew Jim's father, Gerald Powell. Jim is curious how she knows about him, and Gola explains that Gerald had come to her seeking information about subjects like oro, the area, gold, and the impact of white men's greed. Jim urges Gola to tell him everything she shared with his father. She starts by recounting the tragic history of the Cherokee tribe in 1838, when President Jackson sent troops and militia to forcibly remove them from their homeland. Gola explains that her great-grandparents once lived on that land and were among those who endured the Trail of Tears, a journey where thousands perished. Gola goes on to reveal that the Cherokee had discovered gold in their new lands, prompting intense interest from Americans and others who sought the gold but were unable to find it. She discloses to Jim that his father was murdered because he was searching for this elusive gold. Jim is stunned by this revelation, realizing the dangers his father faced in pursuit of this hidden treasure. A woman named Sabal is talking on the phone, clearly agitated. She warns the person on the other end that they must find Jim immediately, emphasizing that there will be serious consequences if they fail to do so. She vents her frustration, blaming someone as an idiot for the situation that led to getting rid of Gerald. Shortly after, Sabal receives a video call on her laptop. She begins discussing Jim, likely with her employee or associate, detailing the urgency and importance of locating him. Jim travels with Gola and asks her why Sabal would want to kill his dad. Gola responds that Sabal isn't human. She had previously killed Gola's uncle. They hunt a squirrel for breakfast, and Gola asks Jim if he likes squirrels, but he prefers beef or deer. Jim then asks Gola about Sabal's powers. Gola explains that according to her grandmother Alicia, a tribe shaman once traveled to the Tennessee River to perform a ritual seeking spiritual and immortal powers. The shaman placed an arrowhead necklace, passed down through generations, into the river. Sabal is now searching for this necklace, and Gola is trying to find it before her. Jim vows to help Gola in her quest. Meanwhile, Sabal's goons arrive at Terry's place and interrogate him about Jim. Terry insists he only knows that Gerald's son is asking questions around town about his father, nothing more. The goons threaten Terry with a gun, demanding confirmation. In response, Terry punches one of the goons in the face. Jim and Gola discover a camping car and decide to sit inside and drive it. While on the road, Jim notices some carvings on a stone and asks Gola what they could mean. Gola explains that these carvings were made by hunters while resting and waiting to pass through, depicting various animals. Jim then asks about the specific animals depicted. Suddenly, Gola is surprised to see something written on the stone and exclaims that it says Ara, which is the Cherokee word for water. Meanwhile, Sabal's goon returns to her and reports about Jim's tracks. Angrily, Sabal slaps the goon and dismisses his suggestions. Jim and Gola continue their journey and come across a beautiful waterfall. They are delighted by the sight, and Gola fondly recalls swimming there as a child. Afterward, they enter a lush green forest where Gola suddenly remembers something from her past associated with the place. She begins to feel faint, prompting Jim to ask if she's okay. Concerned for her well-being, Jim suggests they turn back for the day and return tomorrow. As they start to leave, Sabal's goons appear and confront them, pointing guns and demanding the map. Jim admits the map is in his pocket, and Hawk grabs it from him. Jim swiftly tackles Hawk, sparking a brawl. Despite the skirmish, Jim and Gola manage to regain control of the situation, but Gola is injured when she's shot in the shoulder. They retreat to safety in a nearby cabin where they discuss the significance of the place Gola remembered from her past. Meanwhile, back with Sabal's group, Hawk is chastised and beaten by Sabal's goons for failing to capture Jim and Gola. He is frustrated by their inability to succeed in their mission. Jim and Gola are thrilled as they start piecing together clues. Gola excitedly mentions that the secret rocks and white rocks now make sense. Jim advises her to slow down and explain everything. Gola shares that her uncle used to take her to these places when she was younger: the fields, the white rocks, and the secret rock. Jim is excited, realizing that the power of the arrowhead might be the map itself. They hug each other. Gola further reveals that Sabal has been targeting everyone who helped Jim's father and her uncle since they began searching for gold. The next morning, Jim apologizes to Gola for being rude the previous night. Just as they are about to kiss, they hear a gunshot. They quickly grab their essential luggage and flee in the car. Sabal has sent a sniper named Danya to kill them. Meanwhile, Sabal is arguing with Mrs. Faith. Danya arrives and explains that she can't kill Jim and Gola, but will find and eliminate them. She describes Gola's appearance to Sabal, who remembers having killed Gola's uncle. Jim and Gola are driving when they notice they are being followed by another car. They manage to escape safely. Back with Sabal, Janie approaches and says she will continue to pretend to be Jim's sister's friend and even form a relationship with him for their benefit. Sabal remains silent, prompting Janie to ask if she did something wrong. Sabal coldly says she doesn't need her anymore and points a gun at Janie, who promises to bring Jim to her. Jim and his student are hiding, searching for something, when a dog starts barking. A man named Hank comes out and points a gun at them, demanding they identify themselves. Jim introduces himself as Jim Powell. Hank recognizes him and hugs him. Jim explains that he needs to borrow Hank's RTV for a special project and promises to return it after a few days. As they are leaving, Hank jokes with Jim's student Barry, advising him to find better friends to hang out with. Everyone laughs. Meanwhile, Janie is sitting with Jim's sister Deb and asks about Jim's location. Deb says she doesn't know. Gola, hiding beneath a tree, watches them. Suddenly, a goon attacks Gola, injuring her. Despite her injury, Gola fights back, overpowers the goon, and escapes. She quickly calls Jim, urgently asking him to come to her immediately. Jim arrives to pick up Gola along with Barry. They drive back to their house and discuss past events. Suddenly, Jim hears a knock on the door. He grabs his gun and carefully opens the door to find his sister Deb and Janie standing there. Jim introduces Gola to them. Deb says she'll meet him tomorrow despite Jim insisting he has important work. Janie tries to flirt with Jim and invites him to dinner, but he refuses, citing his work. Janie leaves disappointed. Gola tells Jim that she doesn't like Janie and asks how she knew about this place. Jim explains that it's not Janie but Deb because they used this place as a party house when they were kids. Gola worries that it's unsafe for them to be found there because Sabal's people are everywhere. Later, Jim and Gola are outside when they see armed people approaching the house. They quickly escape safely in the car. Janie excitedly reaches Sabal and informs her about Jim's location. Sabal, unimpressed, tells Janie she only cares about one thing: the gold and the special arrowhead. Janie mentions there are thousands of arrowheads, but Sabal clarifies that the one she needs can tell the future, provide privileged and confidential information, and even stop time. Sabal receives a call, becomes angry, and declares it's time to make things personal. As Jim and Gola drive, Gola warns Jim that Sabal's people are everywhere and suggests Janie might be Sabal's partner. Jim receives a message with a photo of his sister Deb being kidnapped. Gola realizes they want the arrowhead, which is why they've taken Deb. They receive another message instructing them to go to the end of Farmington Road within 1 hour to hand over the arrowhead. Deb is tied up with ropes. Sabal interrogates her about Jim's location, but Deb insists she doesn't know. Angry, Sabal threatens Deb, warning her to reveal Jim's location or watch him die. Deb cries and reiterates she knows nothing. Sabal asks about the arrowhead, but Deb claims she has nothing to do with it and points out there are thousands of arrowheads. Janie appears, cleverly smiling, and tells Sabal this is what she's been saying. Deb is happy to see her friend and asks Janie for help. Janie smiles and says,
"It's just business."
She informs Sabal that Jim is on his way. Sabal orders Danya, the sniper, to take her position, instructing her not to kill them. Gola is at the waterfall when Jim arrives, but Sabal's goons capture him and tie him to a chair next to his sister Deb. Jim asks Deb if she's okay. Sabal arrives and says she's excited to meet him. Jim, confused, says he doesn't know what she's talking about. Sabal calls Janie over and asks Jim if he remembers her. Janie demands the arrowhead, but Jim insists he doesn't know where it is. Sabal orders her goon, Vant, to cut off Deb's hand. Jim shouts for them to stop. Suddenly, Glenn appears with a gun. Jim is initially relieved to see his friend, but is shocked to learn that Glenn works for Sabal. Glenn reveals he has brought Gola as a gift for Sabal. Jim secretly asks Gola if she found the arrowhead, and she says yes. Sabal demands the arrowhead. Janie takes the map from Jim and gives it to Sabal. The goons untie Jim and bring him to Sabal to explain the map. Before explaining, Jim promises Sabal that he will kill her for murdering his father. Sabal laughs. Sabal shoots Gola, and Jim runs towards her, but the goons capture him again. Jim starts to explain the map. Sabal is pleased and starts talking to Jim, but suddenly, Gola appears and slaps Sabal. Jim takes control of the situation. Deb fights with Janie, and Jim shoots Sabal. Everyone is safe. Jim asks Gola how she survived the gunshot. Barry arrives with someone to meet them. Jim goes outside and sees Davison. Deb asks if they know each other, and they confirm they do. Davison gives Jim a picture of Gola with her uncle and Jim's father, which Jim had never seen. Gola reveals she never liked the picture and explains that the shaman was her uncle. She shares that she survived the gunshot because of the arrowhead, which made her immortal. She is 200 years old. Jim jokes that he doesn't mind loving old ladies.